And that's what rock and roll is all about, that edge, the peak, the thing. And this song's about rock.
Neil Young has always walked his own path, fiercely independent, unpredictable, and deeply authentic. For more than 6 decades, he's been one of rock's most uncompromising voices, creating music that speaks straight to the soul. Whether it was his time with Buffalo Springfield, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, or his groundbreaking solo career, Neil has never chased trends. He's defined them. But at 79, Young has finally done something fans never expected. He revealed his 10 favorite rock albums of all time, the records that shaped his sound, his spirit, and his creative vision. For a man who's always been reluctant to look backward, this revelation feels monumental. Each album on the list isn't just a favorite, it's a piece of his musical DNA, a window into the influences that helped shape one of the greatest songwriters of all time. Friends say Neil spent weeks reflecting on the choices, listening to old vinyls in his rustic California home, surrounded by guitars, amplifiers, and the smell of pine wood. He took it seriously, one close friend said. He wasn't just naming hits, he was naming the albums that changed him, the ones that made him believe in the power of music. From blues-soaked rock to folk-infused masterpieces, Neil's list spans eras, moods, and generations. It's raw, honest, and completely true to who he is, and no filters, no compromises. For fans, it's not just a playlist. It's a journey through the heart and mind of a legend who changed the course of rock music forever. When Neil Young sat down to reflect on the albums that shaped him, he didn't start with fame, charts, or radio hits. He started with feeling. The young man who once left Canada in search of musical truth has always been driven by emotion, and that emotion was sparked by the records that first made him fall in love with sound, sources close to Young say the earliest albums on his list come from the folk and blues, traditions that laid the groundwork for rock itself. Neil grew up listening to the honesty in those songs, said a longtime friend. He admired artists who didn't hide behind production, who just told the truth with a guitar and a voice. For Young, authenticity was everything. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about being real. One of the albums that made the list came from a blues legend whose haunting vocals and minimalist guitar style resonated deeply with him. Neil reportedly spent countless hours in his youth listening to that record, trying to understand how such simple arrangements could carry so much emotion. That record taught him that power isn't in volume, a collaborator recalled. It's in vulnerability. Another early influence was a folk rock album that blended poetry with melody in a way that spoke directly to Young's sensibilities. The songwriting, introspective, rebellious, and unpolished, mirrored the direction Neil would later take in his own work. He found a piece of himself in that music, said a producer. It gave him permission to write from the gut, even if it wasn't pretty. As his list continued to grow, it became clear that Young's taste was rooted in simplicity and soul. He gravitated toward albums where emotion took precedence over technical perfection, records that captured moments rather than polished products. He's always believed that music should feel alive, said one fellow musician. Those albums sound like they were recorded in a heartbeat, full of mistakes, but full of truth. Among the albums that stood out were ones that showcased fearless experimentation. Neil admired artists who weren't afraid to take risks, who bent genres and pushed sonic boundaries. He respects anyone who breaks the mold, said a close friend. That's something he's done his whole life. He never plays it safe. Interestingly, some of the albums on his list weren't commercial successes when they were released. Yet, over time, they gained cult status for their raw artistry and emotional honesty, qualities Neil has built his entire career around. He doesn't care about popularity, said a longtime bandmate. He cares about the truth in the music. As he looked back, Young reflected on how these early influences molded him as both a performer and a songwriter. The vulnerability of folk, the grit of blues, and the rebellion of rock, they all found their way into his DNA. You can hear it in his voice, in his phrasing, in his lyrics, said one journalist. These albums weren't just records to him. They were teachers. When asked why he decided to share his favorites now, Neil reportedly said, "Because I finally understand what they gave me. I can see their fingerprints. On Everything I've Ever Written, the first few albums on Neil, Young's list paint a picture of a young dreamer searching for authenticity and finding it in the rawest corners of music. They represent the beginning of a lifelong journey toward honesty in art, a journey that would eventually lead him to create some of the most iconic songs in rock history. As Neil Young's career began to take shape in the mid to late 1960s, his musical taste evolved alongside the rock revolution that was sweeping the world. The young Canadian songwriter who once strummed folk tunes in quiet coffeehouses was suddenly surrounded by amplifiers, distortion pedals, and the raw electricity of a new era. It was during this time that several albums, the kind that reshaped the sound of rock forever, left a deep impression on him and found their way onto his list of 10 favorites. According to close friends, Neil's choices from this era weren't just about big hits or flashy guitar work. They were about spirit, records that carried rebellion, pain, and passion in every groove. He's never been drawn to polish, one musician explained. Neil loves records that sound alive, where you can hear the amps buzzing and the singer losing control. That's what makes it real. One of the albums he singled out was a gritty, feedback-heavy masterpiece that showed him how chaos could be musical. Young admired how the band behind the record embraced imperfection, turning distortion and noise into something beautiful. That record taught him that sound itself could be expressive, said a longtime collaborator. He realized that you didn't have to play clean to play. Honest, another album on his list came from one of the defining voices of 1960s rock, and a record that combined poetic lyrics with socially charged messages. Neil reportedly said that this particular album made him see songwriting as more than art. It was a weapon, a form of protest. It gave him a sense of purpose, a journalist close to him shared. He saw that a song could speak for people who didn't have a voice. As Neil's own music grew louder and more experimental, these albums continued to guide him. The balance of melody and noise, message and emotion became his formula. You can hear their influence in Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere, After the Gold Rush, and Rust Never Sleeps, records where soft acoustic confessions meet roaring electric storms. Those albums he loved gave him permission to do both, said a producer. To whisper one moment and explode the next. What's fascinating is that Neil's list also includes albums that defied the trends of their time. While many bands chased the psychedelic craze, some of his favorite artists stayed rooted in sincerity and songwriting. Those albums reminded him that even amid distortion and excess, truth still mattered most. He loves when music cuts through the noise, said a friend. When it stops trying to impress and just says what it needs to say. Young has often said that the most powerful thing about rock music is its honesty. The albums from this period reinforce that belief, showing him that music could be political, spiritual, and deeply personal all at once. He never saw rock as entertainment, explained a fellow musician. He saw it as a movement, something that could change hearts and minds. Even now, at 79, Neil reportedly still listens to these records, sometimes late at night in his barn studio. The vinyl crackles, the guitars wail, and he nods along, the same way he did when he was a young man trying to find his place in the chaos. Those records still sound alive to him, a close friend said. He says they remind him why he picked up a guitar in the first place. For Neil Young, the albums that defined the rock revolution weren't just about sound, they were about conviction. They taught him that real music doesn't follow rules, and that every note, no matter how imperfect, carries the truth of the person playing it. As the years rolled on and Neil Young carved his own place among the greatest songwriters of all time, his connection to music grew deeper, more introspective, more spiritual. While the earlier albums on his list taught him rebellion and raw sound, the next set spoke to his heart. These were the records that shaped his songwriting. Not just how he played, but how he felt. According to those close to him, Young's next few favorite albums weren't about loud guitars or studio perfection. They were about humanity. Neil's always been about truth and vulnerability, a longtime friend shared. He connects with records that show the cracks, albums where the singer is hanging by a thread, but still pushing through. One album on his list, a haunting folk rock masterpiece, moved him in ways words could barely describe. The honesty in its lyrics and the quiet ache in its melodies reminded him of the importance of writing from the soul. He listened to that album during hard times, a collaborator recalled. It helped him understand that pain could be turned into art, that the more personal you are, the more universal your music becomes. Another record that made a deep impact came from a singer-songwriter whose confessional storytelling style mirrored Neil's own. The album's themes of loneliness, faith, and the passage of time struck a chord with him. "Neil doesn't write songs for the charts," said a music journalist. "He writes songs to make sense of life." And that's what he heard in this record. Several of the albums on his list also reflect his respect for simplicity. To Neil, great songs don't need layers of production or flashy solos, just a voice, a story, and the right chord. He believes that if you can play a song on an acoustic guitar and it still moves people, then it's real, said a producer who worked with him in the 1990s. These albums reminded him of that. Yet, not every record that shaped him was soft or sentimental. A few on the list are bold, politically charged works that reminded Neil of the responsibility artists have to speak truth to power. These albums, filled with anger, hope, and rebellion, inspired him to write songs that didn't just entertain, but challenged listeners to think. "He's never been afraid to be controversial," said a close associate. Those albums showed him that honesty is more important than approval. Interestingly, one album on the list isn't by a rock artist at all, but by a soul legend whose emotional intensity left a lasting impression. "Neil says that voice could cut right through you," revealed a friend. It taught him that it's not about genre. It's about heart. All these records share one thing. They tell the truth. And for Neil Young, truth is the foundation of everything he's ever written. His music, from Harvest to Tonight's the Night to Silver and Gold, carries the same vulnerability, grit, and emotional honesty that he found in these albums. "When you listen to the records he loves," a journalist noted, "you start to understand him more. They're like puzzle pieces that fit perfectly with his own songs." At 79, Neil still talks about these albums with a kind of reverence, like they're old friends who've guided him through the ups and downs of life. "He doesn't just admire them," said one close confidant. "He feels them. They've been with him through everything. The success, the loss, the silence." The albums that shaped Neil Young's songwriting and spirit are more than just a list of favorites. They're a reflection of a lifetime spent chasing honesty, in music, in love, and in the human condition. Each one reminds him that true art isn't about perfection. It's about connection. And for Neil, that's what music has always been about. As Neil Young approaches his 80th year, his outlook on music, and life itself, has taken on an even deeper sense of reflection. Sitting in his rustic California home, surrounded by vintage guitars and stacks of worn-out vinyl, Neil often speaks about the albums that have carried him through each decade. "They're not just records," he once said softly. "They're pieces of time, memories pressed into wax." The final few albums on his list, the ones he says he couldn't live without, reveal not only his taste, but his soul. One of them is a record born out of grief, a masterpiece that taught Neil how to transform pain into beauty. "That album showed me how to keep moving when everything feels broken," he said in a rare interview. "It reminded me that music can save you when nothing else can." Another favorite is a daring experimental work that most critics didn't understand when it first came out. But Neil loved it precisely for that reason. "He's always been drawn to outsiders," said one of his longtime friends. "He respects artists who take risks, who follow their instincts even when the world laughs at them." That's who Neil is, too. Through the years, Neil's own catalog has mirrored those influences. From the electric fury of Rust Never Sleeps to the quiet ache of Harvest Moon, his songs have balanced rebellion with reflection. "Each of those albums he loves can be heard echoing somewhere in his own work," said a music historian. They taught him courage, honesty, and the beauty of imperfection. When asked what connects all 10 albums on his list, Neil didn't hesitate. "They're real," he said simply. "They weren't made for trends or fame. They were made because the artists had something burning inside them, something they had to say." That authenticity is something Neil has fought to protect all his life. He never chased commercial success, and he's been known to walk away from fame whenever it threatened his truth. It's why his music still feels timeless, untouched by the shallow gloss of the industry. Neil has never belonged to an era, said a former bandmate. He's always belonged to himself. Even now, as he looks back on a lifetime of music, he continues to find new meaning in those old records. He still spins them on his turntable late at night, sometimes smiling, sometimes lost in thought. He'll close his eyes and just listen, a close friend shared. It's like he's visiting old friends, talking to the ghosts of who he used to be. And while Neil doesn't often speak publicly about legacy, those who know him say he's proud of what he's left behind. He hopes his own records will do for others what those albums did for him, said his son. To make people feel something real, even for just a moment. As for the fans who followed him through decades of change, Neil Young's list of favorite rock albums offers a window into his heart. It's not just a guide to what he admires, it's a map of what shaped him. From protest anthems to whispered folk ballads, from soul cries to raw guitar riffs, each album carries a lesson. That truth outlasts fame, and honesty outshines perfection. In the twilight of his career, Neil still believes in the power of music to heal and to unite. The right song, he once said, can carry you through a lifetime. And for him, those 10 records have done exactly that, soundtracking every triumph. Heartbreak and moment of clarity. Neil Young may have built a legacy of his own, but deep down, he remains a fan, a man forever inspired by the music that spoke to his soul. And as long as those albums keep spinning, a part of Neil will keep singing right along with them.